Fear is not a flaw in the human mind. It is one of its oldest design features. In this video, we explore where human fears truly come from, not through stories or symbolism, but through the biology of the brain itself. You will hear why the human brain is naturally built to detect threats, how ancient neural systems like the amygdala shaped fear long before language existed, and why certain fears, darkness, uncertainty, the unknown still feel real even in safe environments. We will look at how evolution passed fear forward across generations, how the brain learns what to fear, and why some fears protect us while others no longer serve a purpose. As the night progresses and thinking slows, these systems become more noticeable, which is why fear often feels stronger after dark. This is not a video about panic or anxiety, but about understanding fear as a biological signal, an inherited survival tool, and a deeply human process. By the end, you will not be trying to fight fear, but simply observing how the brain creates it and how that understanding naturally allows the mind to soften, slow down, and rest. The human brain did not evolve to make us calm, optimistic, or comfortable. It evolved to keep us alive. Long before modern life, language, or even complex social structures, survival depended on one primary function: detecting danger before it was too late. This is why the brain is fundamentally a prediction and threat detection machine. From the earliest moments of consciousness, neural systems continuously scan the environment, not for pleasure or beauty, but for irregularities, movement, contrast, and uncertainty. Safety is assumed only temporarily. Danger is always a possibility. This bias is not accidental. It is the result of millions of years in which those who detected threats faster were the ones who survived long enough to reproduce. At the core of this system is the principle of asymmetry. The brain learned very early that false alarms are cheaper than missed threats. Mistaking a shadow for a predator costs energy. Failing to notice a real predator costs life. As a result, human perception is skewed toward caution. Sensory input is filtered and interpreted through circuits that prioritize potential harm over neutrality. This is why ambiguous stimuli often feel unsettling, and why silence, darkness, or stillness can trigger unease even in objectively safe environments. The brain does not ask, "Is this dangerous?" It asks, "Could this be dangerous?" and acts accordingly. This threat-sensitive architecture is deeply embedded in subcortical brain regions that operate faster than conscious thought. These systems do not wait for logic or reasoning. They react within milliseconds, long before the prefrontal cortex has time to analyze or contextualize what is happening. In evolutionary terms, speed mattered more than accuracy. The brain that hesitated to analyze every detail did not survive long enough to refine its judgments. As a result, fear responses are often immediate, bodily, and difficult to suppress using rational thought alone. They are not errors in thinking. They are reflections of how the brain was built to function. Over time, this architecture became increasingly refined. The brain learned to associate patterns with outcomes, storing memories of threat and linking them to sensory cues. Certain sounds, shapes, or environmental conditions became shortcuts to survival decisions. Darkness, for example, reduced visual information, increasing uncertainty and therefore perceived risk. The brain adapted by increasing vigilance under low information conditions. Even today, when physical threats are rare, these ancient associations remain active. The environment may have changed, but the neural blueprint has not. Importantly, this system does not turn off simply because danger is absent. It operates continuously in the background, modulating attention, emotion, and physiological arousal. During the day, cognitive demands and external stimuli keep these processes partially masked. At night, however, when sensory input decreases and mental activity slows, the threat detection system becomes more noticeable. The brain, no longer occupied with tasks, returns to its default mode of scanning and predicting. This is one reason why fears feel louder in the dark and why intrusive thoughts often emerge before sleep. From a biological perspective, fear is not a malfunction but a signal. It reflects the brain's ongoing attempt to reduce uncertainty in an unpredictable world. The discomfort associated with fear is what makes the signal effective. Without it, the brain would not prioritize learning, memory formation, or behavioral adjustment. Fear shapes attention, reinforces memory, and influences decision-making in ways that have historically improved survival. Even when it feels excessive, it is operating according to rules that once kept humans alive. Understanding this changes the way fear is experienced. Instead of viewing it as an enemy, it becomes possible to see it as a byproduct of an ancient system doing exactly what it was designed to do. The brain is not trying to disturb you, especially at night. It is reverting to its most fundamental role, monitoring the unknown. And as this video continues, we will begin to see how this system developed, how it learned what to fear, and why some of its signals remain powerful long after their original purpose has faded. To understand why fear became such a dominant force in the human brain, it is necessary to step away from modern life and return to the conditions under which the nervous system was shaped. For most of human history, existence unfolded in environments defined by uncertainty, scarcity, and constant exposure to risk. Food was not guaranteed, shelter was temporary, and danger could emerge without warning. In such conditions, the individuals who survived were not the strongest or the most intelligent in abstract terms, but those whose brains reacted quickly to potential threats. Fear was not an emotional burden. It was a biological advantage that improved odds of survival on a daily basis. From an evolutionary perspective, fear functions as a prioritization mechanism. The brain receives far more sensory information than it can consciously process, so it must decide what matters most. Fear assigns urgency. It amplifies certain signals while suppressing others, forcing attention toward what could threaten survival. This mechanism ensured that critical cues, unfamiliar sounds, sudden movements, changes in the environment were not ignored. Over generations, nervous systems that responded strongly to such cues were more likely to pass their genes forward. Gradually, fear became deeply encoded into neural architecture, not as an optional response, but as a default mode of operation. Crucially, evolution does not optimize for comfort or happiness. It optimizes for continuation. A brain that feels too safe is a brain that takes risks. A brain that questions every fear response too carefully is a brain that reacts too slowly. Evolution favored systems that erred on the side of caution, even if that meant generating unnecessary fear from time to time. In this context, anxiety and vigilance were not malfunctions, but protective features. They increased awareness, sharpened perception, and encouraged avoidance of uncertain situations that could prove fatal. This is why fear responses are often disproportionate to actual danger in the modern world. The brain does not measure risk in contemporary terms. It relies on ancestral probability. It interprets uncertainty itself as a threat because, historically, uncertainty often preceded harm. A rustling sound in the dark, a sudden silence, or an unfamiliar environment all carried real consequences for early humans. The modern brain still reacts to these cues with the same biological urgency, even when logical reasoning suggests safety. The emotional intensity remains because the underlying system was never designed to update itself based on cultural progress. Over time, fear became integrated with learning and memory. Experiences that involved danger or near misses were encoded more deeply than neutral events. This allowed the brain to avoid repeating harmful situations and to teach future generations, indirectly, through inherited predispositions. Certain fears did not need to be learned individually. They were statistically reliable enough to be passed down. Heights, darkness, isolation, and sudden loss of control became universally unsettling because they historically correlated with high risk. These fears feel instinctive because, in many cases, they are at night. This evolutionary logic becomes more visible. When external demands fade and sensory input decreases, the brain returns to its most ancient priorities. With fewer distractions to occupy attention, the threat monitoring system becomes more prominent. This does not mean danger has increased. It means the brain is operating in a mode closer to its original evolutionary context. Darkness reduces information, silence removes predictive cues, and stillness amplifies internal signals. The brain responds by increasing vigilance, allowing fear-related thoughts to surface more easily. Seen through this lens, fear is not something that suddenly appears at night. It is something that is always present, but usually overshadowed by activity, light, and social interaction. When those buffers disappear, fear feels stronger, not because it has grown, but because it has less competition. The evolutionary brain is simply more audible in quiet conditions. Understanding this reframes fear from a personal failure into a biological inheritance, one that once protected life and continues to shape how the mind behaves when the world grows dark and still. Even though the world humans inhabit today is radically different from the one in which the brain evolved, the internal machinery responsible for fear has remained largely unchanged. Evolution does not redesign systems from scratch. It modifies what already exists. As a result, modern human consciousness sits on top of neural circuits that were built for a far more dangerous and unpredictable environment. These circuits operate continuously beneath awareness, shaping perception, emotion, and bodily responses long before conscious thought becomes involved. Fear emerges not because something is wrong, but because these systems are still active, still running the same algorithms they have always run. At the center of these processes are deeply embedded neural pathways that connect sensory input directly to emotional and physiological reactions. These pathways bypass slow, analytical reasoning and instead favor speed and efficiency. From an evolutionary standpoint, this design was essential. Early humans did not have time to reflect on whether a sound in the dark was truly dangerous. Hesitation could mean injury or death. The brain, therefore, developed shortcuts, automatic responses that translated uncertainty into alertness, tension, and readiness to act. These responses occur so quickly that they feel instinctive, uncontrollable, and sometimes irrational. What makes these circuits particularly powerful is their independence from conscious control. Logical reassurance does not easily deactivate them because they were never designed to listen to logic. They were designed to listen to probability. If a situation shares features with past threats, darkness, isolation, unpredictability, the system activates regardless of context. This is why fear can persist even when safety is intellectually understood. The ancient brain does not ask whether a fear makes sense in the modern world. It asks whether ignoring it could carry a cost. These survival circuits are also deeply interconnected with memory. Experiences associated with danger are stored more vividly and retrieved more easily than neutral or pleasant events. This bias ensures that lessons related to survival are not forgotten. Over time, repeated activation strengthens these pathways, making certain fears feel automatic. The brain learns not only from personal experience, but from patterns that have been reinforced across generations. Some fears arrive already partially formed, requiring little direct experience to feel real. They are the echoes of ancestral environments still resonating within neural tissue. As the day ends and external stimulation decreases, the influence of these ancient circuits becomes more apparent. During waking hours, attention is directed outward toward tasks, conversations, screens, and structured environments. These activities engage higher cortical regions that suppress or override primitive threat responses. At night, however, this top-down control weakens. Cognitive demands fade, sensory input diminishes, and the brain shifts toward internal monitoring. In this quieter state, older systems regain influence, and fear-related thoughts can surface with greater clarity. This shift is not pathological. It reflects a rebalancing of neural priorities. The brain, no longer required to manage complex social or cognitive tasks, reverts to maintenance mode. In this mode, it reviews internal states, scans for unresolved signals, and prepares the organism for vulnerability during sleep. Fear, in this context, functions as a final check, an ancient mechanism ensuring that conditions are safe enough to let consciousness go. If uncertainty remains, the brain resists full relaxation, keeping awareness partially engaged. Understanding this process reveals why fear often feels more intense when the body is still and the mind is quiet. It is not that fear increases, but that the modern layers of distraction fall away, exposing older structures underneath. The brain has not forgotten where it came from. It still carries the imprint of countless nights spent in environments where darkness truly meant danger. When night falls today, those memories are not consciously recalled, but their influence remains embedded in the architecture of the mind, quietly shaping the experience of fear as consciousness prepares to drift towards sleep. As night settles in and external stimulation gradually fades, the human brain enters a state that is far closer to its original operating conditions than most people realize. Light diminishes, movement slows, social signals disappear, and the flow of information from the environment becomes sparse. For a brain that evolved in open landscapes without artificial lighting or physical barriers, this reduction in sensory input is not neutral. It is interpreted as vulnerability. Quiet does not signal safety to the ancient brain. It signals uncertainty. And where uncertainty appears, fear is given space to speak. During the day, fear competes with countless cognitive demands. Attention is occupied by tasks, conversations, visual complexity, and structured goals. These higher-order processes engage cortical regions responsible for planning, reasoning, and contextual interpretation. They act as a form of neural noise that suppresses deeper signals. At night, this noise recedes. The prefrontal cortex reduces its dominance, sensory processing slows, and the brain begins to turn inward. In this internalized state, previously muted signals, bodily sensations, unresolved emotions, faint threat cues become more noticeable. Fear does not suddenly appear. It becomes audible because the volume of everything else has dropped. Silence itself plays a critical role in this shift. From an evolutionary perspective, silence was rarely benign. In natural environments, sudden quiet often meant that other animals had detected danger and stopped moving, or that a predator was nearby. The brain learned to associate silence with heightened risk. Even today, when silence is artificially created and objectively safe, the nervous system reacts according to these older rules. The absence of sound removes predictive information, forcing the brain to fill in gaps. Fear thrives in these gaps because it represents the safest possible interpretation when data is incomplete. Darkness amplifies this effect further by reducing visual certainty. Vision is the dominant human sense, and when it is compromised, the brain compensates by increasing vigilance in other systems. Heart rate may rise slightly, muscles may remain subtly tense, and attention shifts toward internal sensations. Thoughts that were easy to dismiss during the day gain emotional weight at night because the brain has fewer external anchors to counterbalance them. What feels like overthinking is often the brain's attempt to resolve uncertainty before allowing consciousness to fully disengage. Importantly, this nighttime amplification of fear is not a flaw in emotional regulation. It is a protective delay mechanism. Sleep renders the organism temporarily defenseless. For most of evolutionary history, falling asleep in the wrong conditions could be fatal. The brain therefore developed thresholds that must be met before sleep is permitted. Safety must feel sufficiently predictable. When fear arises at night, it is often the brain asking a final question: is it safe to let go? If the answer is unclear, arousal increases just enough to keep awareness active. Modern environments confuse this system. Physical safety may be objectively guaranteed, but the brain does not evaluate safety through logic alone. It evaluates patterns, signals, and probabilities based on ancient criteria. Artificial lighting, isolated sleeping spaces, and cognitive stress carried into the night can all interfere with the brain's assessment. Fear emerges not because danger is present, but because the system responsible for detecting danger has not received the signals it needs to stand down. Recognizing this process changes the relationship with fear. Instead of resisting it or interpreting it as a personal failure, fear can be understood as a transitional state, a byproduct of the brain shifting from external engagement to internal regulation. As this shift completes, fear often softens on its own. The brain does not need to be forced into calm. It needs clarity and predictability. And when those conditions are met, even ancient systems learn, temporarily, to rest. Fear existed long before humans had words to describe it. Before language, before symbols, before stories or shared explanations, fear was already shaping behavior at the most fundamental level. Early human brains did not need names for danger in order to respond to it. They needed only patterns, changes in sound, shifts in light, unfamiliar movements, sudden absences. Fear emerged as a pre-linguistic signal, encoded directly into neural activity, guiding action without requiring conscious interpretation. In this sense, fear is not something humans learned to feel. It is something the brain already knew how to do before thought itself became structured. Language arrived relatively late in human evolution, but the fear system was already deeply refined. Neural circuits responsible for threat detection developed in environments where hesitation meant vulnerability. These systems communicated internally through electrical and chemical signals, not through words. They shaped posture, breathing, muscle tension, and attention automatically. Even today, fear often manifests physically before it becomes a thought. The body reacts first, tightening, orienting, preparing, while the mind struggles to catch up. This order reveals fear's origin. It was never designed to be explained. It was designed to be effective. Because fear predates language, it also operates independently of narrative. It does not care about logic, reassurance, or explanation. Telling the brain that something is safe does not immediately deactivate fear responses, because those responses do not depend on verbal reasoning. They depend on probability assessments learned over vast spans of time. This is why fear can persist even when danger is intellectually dismissed. The system responsible for fear does not speak the same language as conscious thought. It speaks in sensations, impulses, and physiological shifts. This pre-linguistic nature of fear also explains its universality. Across cultures, ages, and historical periods, certain fears appear again and again. Darkness, isolation, sudden loss of control, and the unknown trigger similar reactions in nearly all humans. These responses do not need to be taught. They emerge spontaneously because they are rooted in shared biology rather than shared culture. Language may shape how fear is interpreted or expressed, but it does not create fear itself. The source lies deeper, in neural architecture shaped long before words existed. At night, when language-based thinking begins to fade, fear often becomes more noticeable. Internal dialogue slows, analytical reasoning weakens, and the mind drifts toward a more primitive mode of awareness. In this state, the brain relies less on structured thought and more on sensory memory and pattern recognition. Fear fits naturally into this mode because it evolved to function without language. As verbal thought recedes, fear does not lose power. Instead, it becomes one of the dominant signals guiding internal experience. This shift can feel unsettling because modern humans are accustomed to understanding themselves through words. When thoughts become less verbal and more diffuse, fear can feel unanchored, harder to explain, and therefore more intrusive. Yet this experience is not a regression. It is a temporary return to an older form of cognition, one that operates beneath language and does not require explanation to function. The brain is not malfunctioning. It is transitioning into a state where ancient systems temporarily take the lead. Understanding that fear is older than language changes how it is perceived. Fear does not arise because the mind is weak or because thoughts are out of control. It arises because a deeply embedded system is functioning exactly as it was designed to function when verbal reasoning is offline. The absence of words does not leave a void, it reveals what has always been there. And as the night deepens and language continues to dissolve, fear stands as one of the clearest reminders that the brain remembers a world far older than speech, still quietly guiding behavior as consciousness prepares to rest. Deep within the human brain lies a structure so old that it predates not only language but conscious self-awareness itself. The amygdala is not concerned with meaning, morality, or narrative. It is concerned with relevance and urgency. Long before the cortex learned how to think, plan, or reflect, the amygdala learned how to detect what mattered for survival. Its task has always been simple and absolute: identify potential threats and mobilize the body before conscious thought has time to interfere. This function has remained largely unchanged across mammalian evolution, and its influence is still felt every time fear arises without warning. The amygdala operates as an alarm system rather than a reasoning center. It does not analyze situations in detail, it evaluates patterns. Sensory information arrives and is rapidly compared to stored templates of past danger. If similarity is detected, the amygdala activates instantly, sending signals throughout the brain and body. Heart rate increases, muscles tense, attention narrows, and stress hormones are released all before the conscious mind has identified what triggered the response. This speed is not accidental. In evolutionary terms, reacting first and explaining later was often the difference between survival and extinction. What makes the amygdala particularly powerful is its direct access to sensory pathways. Visual and auditory information can reach it without passing through higher cortical areas responsible for logic and context. This means fear can be triggered even when the cortex would later judge the situation as harmless. A sudden sound, a movement in peripheral vision, or an unexpected silence can activate the amygdala independently of conscious evaluation. The system does not wait for permission because it was never designed to ask for it. Its authority comes from age, not from accuracy. Over time, the amygdala becomes a repository of emotionally charged memories. Experiences associated with fear are stored with exceptional strength, creating long-lasting associations between stimuli and emotional response. This allows the brain to respond more quickly in the future, but it also means that fear can be reactivated in situations that only loosely resemble the original threat. The system generalizes because, historically, generalization increased survival. It is safer to overreact to a harmless cue than to underreact to a dangerous one. The cost of false fear was energy. The cost of missed fear was life. At night, the influence of the amygdala often becomes more pronounced. As cognitive control weakens and sensory input decreases, the balance of power within the brain shifts. The prefrontal cortex, which normally moderates emotional responses, reduces its activity. In this quieter neural landscape, signals from the amygdala face less resistance. Emotional reactions feel stronger, less filtered, and more immediate. Thoughts may appear suddenly, charged with emotion but lacking clear origin. This is not because fear has intensified, but because the systems that usually regulate it have stepped back. Darkness further enhances the amygdala's sensitivity. Reduced visual information increases uncertainty, and uncertainty is one of the amygdala's strongest activation triggers. When the brain cannot clearly predict what lies ahead, it defaults to caution. The amygdala fills in missing information with probability-based assumptions shaped by evolutionary history. In environments where darkness once concealed predators and threats, this response was adaptive. In modern bedrooms, it can feel confusing or excessive, but the underlying logic remains the same. Importantly, the amygdala does not distinguish between physical and abstract threats. Social rejection, loss of control, and imagined danger can activate the same circuits as physical harm. This is why fear can arise in the absence of any external stimulus, especially when the mind turns inward at night. Internal images, memories, or unresolved concerns can trigger the same alarm responses as real-world threats. The system responds to perceived significance, not objective reality. Understanding the amygdala's role reframes fear as a biological reflex rather than a personal failure. Fear is not evidence that the mind is losing control. It is evidence that one of the brain's oldest systems is still functioning exactly as intended. As the night progresses and higher cognitive layers quiet down, this ancient alarm becomes easier to hear. And while it may feel intrusive, it is simply the echo of a system that has protected life for millions of years, still active beneath the surface of modern consciousness. Not all fears are learned through personal experience. Some arrive already partially formed, embedded within the nervous system before the first conscious memory ever appears. These inherited fears are not memories in the traditional sense. They are predispositions, biases in perception and reaction shaped by evolutionary pressure over countless generations. The human brain carries statistical knowledge about the world, knowledge accumulated not through individual life events, but through survival patterns repeated across ancestral environments. Fear is one of the primary ways this knowledge expresses itself. Evolution does not transmit specific experiences, but it does transmit tendencies. When certain environmental conditions repeatedly threatened survival, nervous systems that reacted strongly to those conditions were more likely to persist. Over time, these reaction patterns became biologically favored. Darkness, heights, isolation, sudden movement, and unfamiliar sounds consistently correlated with danger in ancestral environments. As a result, the brain learned to treat these cues as significant long before conscious reasoning could intervene. Modern humans inherit these sensitivities not because the dangers still exist in the same form, but because the brain has not been given a reason to remove them. This inherited layer of fear operates beneath awareness, influencing what feels uncomfortable or unsettling without providing a clear explanation. A person may feel anxious standing near a ledge despite knowing it is structurally safe. Another may feel uneasy in complete darkness even when alone in a familiar room. These reactions are not irrational. They reflect probabilistic learning encoded into neural architecture. The brain does not calculate risk based on modern statistics. It responds to ancestral likelihoods that were once reliable indicators of threat. Importantly, inherited fears require very little reinforcement to become active. Unlike learned fears, which depend on direct experience, these predispositions can be triggered by minimal cues. A shadow, a silence, or a sense of being watched can activate deep emotional responses without any conscious association. The speed and intensity of these reactions reveal their origin. They are not constructed through thought, They are revealed when conditions resemble those under which the brain's survival algorithms were written. At night, these inherited fears often become more noticeable because the environment begins to resemble ancestral conditions. Artificial light fades, sensory information becomes incomplete, and the predictability of surroundings decreases. For most of human history, night was the most dangerous period. Visibility was limited, predators were more active, and social support was reduced. The brain adapted by increasing vigilance during darkness. Even today, when night poses little objective risk, the nervous system responds as if the old rules still apply. The context has changed, but the signal processing remains the same. These inherited fears also interact with imagination. When external input decreases, the brain relies more heavily on internal models to predict reality. In low information states, inherited threat templates become more influential. The mind fills in gaps using the most conservative assumptions available. This can manifest as vague unease rather than specific fear, a feeling that something is wrong without knowing what. The discomfort does not need a clear object because it is driven by probability, not certainty. Understanding inherited fear reveals why reassurance often feels ineffective at night. Telling oneself that there is nothing to fear addresses conscious reasoning, but inherited systems do not respond to words. They respond to context, predictability, and sensory confirmation of safety. Until the environment provides enough stable signals, the system remains partially active. This is not resistance or stubbornness. It is biological caution functioning as designed. Seen through this lens, fear becomes less personal and more historical. It is not only your fear, it is the accumulation of countless nights survived by those who came before you. The brain remembers what the body needed long before the mind learned to explain itself. As consciousness slows and the modern world recedes, these ancient patterns rise closer to the surface, not to harm, but to protect. And as the narrative continues, we will begin to see how the brain learns to update these fears and why some of them remain long after their original purpose has faded. While some fears are inherited, many are shaped, refined, and reinforced through experience. The human brain is not born knowing every threat it will ever face. Instead, it is born with a system designed to learn fear efficiently. This learning does not occur through deliberate instruction or conscious analysis. It occurs through association, timing, and emotional intensity. When a neutral stimulus coincides with danger, pain, or loss of control, the brain binds them together, creating a shortcut that allows future reactions to occur faster and with less information. This process is not a flaw in cognition. It is one of the most powerful survival mechanisms the brain possesses. Fear learning is driven by emotional weight rather than factual detail. Events that carry strong emotional charge are encoded more deeply and more persistently than ordinary experiences. The brain treats these moments as biologically significant, prioritizing their storage and retrieval. This is why a single frightening experience can shape behavior for years, while countless neutral experiences leave little trace. The nervous system is not designed to remember everything equally. It is designed to remember what mattered for survival. Fear acts as the marker that tells the brain, this must not be forgotten. Timing plays a critical role in this process. When a stimulus appears just before or during a threatening event, the brain assumes a causal relationship. The association does not need to be accurate, it needs to be fast. From an evolutionary perspective, speed mattered more than precision. If a particular sound once preceded danger, reacting to that sound in the future increased the chances of survival, even if the connection was imperfect. The brain therefore favors learning rules that minimize risk, rather than rules that maximize truth. Fear learning follows probability, not logic. Over time, these learned fears can generalize. A specific trigger expands into a category. A single dangerous situation can give rise to a broader pattern of avoidance. This generalization once protected early humans from repeating fatal mistakes in unfamiliar environments. In modern life, it can feel excessive, but the underlying mechanism remains the same. The brain prefers to widen the safety margin rather than narrow it. Fear grows not because the brain is exaggerating, but because it is optimizing for caution under uncertainty. At night, learned fears often resurface with renewed intensity. As external stimulation decreases and attention turns inward, the brain begins reviewing stored emotional material. This process is part of memory consolidation and emotional regulation. Experiences that were suppressed or overshadowed during the day become more accessible in quiet conditions. Fear-related memories, because they are emotionally prioritized, are often among the first to surface. The mind may replay fragments, sensations, or vague impressions rather than clear narratives, reflecting the non-verbal nature of fear encoding. The absence of distraction allows associative networks to activate more freely. A thought leads to a memory leads to a sensation, and a sensation triggers an emotional response. This cascade does not require conscious intent. It unfolds automatically as the brain shifts toward internal processing. The result can feel like fear appearing out of nowhere, but it is actually the nervous system doing maintenance, reviewing what it has learned, reinforcing what it believes still matters, and updating predictions for the future. Importantly, fear learning is not fixed. While the brain is efficient at acquiring fear, it is also capable of modifying it. Repeated exposure to safe outcomes can weaken associations over time, but this process is slower and more context-dependent. The brain requires consistent evidence that a previously threatening pattern no longer predicts harm. Until that evidence accumulates, fear remains partially active. This persistence is not stubbornness. It is biological conservatism, shaped by millions of years in which abandoning fear too quickly carried unacceptable risk. Understanding how the brain learns fear transforms its meaning. Fear is not proof that something is wrong with the mind. It is proof that the mind is capable of learning, adapting, and protecting. As night deepens and conscious thought loosens its grip, these learned patterns become more visible, not because they are growing stronger, but because the brain is quietly reviewing its internal maps of the world. And in this review, fear appears not as an intruder, but as a record of what the brain once believed it needed to survive. Darkness has never been neutral to the human brain. Long before artificial light reshaped the night, darkness marked the boundary between control and uncertainty. Vision, the dominant human sense, becomes unreliable in low light, and when visual information collapses, the brain does not simply accept the absence of data, it reacts to it. For an organism shaped by environments where unseen threats were real and often lethal, darkness represented a loss of predictive power. The brain learned that when it cannot see clearly, it cannot accurately anticipate what comes next. Fear emerges precisely in this gap between what is known and what can no longer be confirmed. From a neurobiological perspective, darkness reduces sensory certainty, and reduced certainty increases neural vigilance. The brain compensates for missing information by amplifying internal signals and threat monitoring processes. This compensation is not conscious. It is automatic and deeply ingrained. When visual input weakens, other systems step forward, scanning for subtle sounds, bodily sensations, or internal cues that might signal danger. The mind becomes more inwardly focused, not because it chooses to, but because the external world has become less informative. Fear gains prominence in this inward turn because it is one of the brain's primary tools for managing uncertainty. Evolution reinforced this response over countless generations. In ancestral environments, darkness concealed predators, obstacles, and hostile terrain. Night limited mobility, reduced reaction time, and increased vulnerability during rest. Those who treated darkness casually were less likely to survive. Those whose nervous systems responded with caution, alertness, and restraint were more likely to live long enough to pass on their genes. Over time, darkness itself became a conditioned signal for heightened awareness. The brain no longer needed a visible threat. The absence of light was enough to justify vigilance. Even in modern settings, where darkness rarely hides physical danger, the brain continues to operate according to these older rules. Artificial safety does not erase biological memory. A dark room may be structurally secure, but the nervous system does not evaluate safety in architectural terms. It evaluates predictability. Darkness reduces predictability by limiting sensory feedback. The brain responds by increasing sensitivity to ambiguity, and fear naturally follows. This is why even familiar environments can feel subtly different at night, as if the same space carries a different emotional tone once light fades. Darkness also alters the balance between cognitive systems. As visual input decreases, activity in higher cortical regions associated with rational analysis begins to decline. At the same time, subcortical systems linked to emotion and arousal become relatively more influential. This shift is gradual and often unnoticed, but its effects are profound. Thoughts become less structured, imagery becomes more vivid, and emotional signals gain intensity. Fear does not require detailed reasoning to function in this state. It thrives on impression, suggestion, and possibility. Importantly, darkness does not create fear on its own. It reveals it. During the day, visual clarity and constant stimulation suppress many internal signals. Light provides continuous confirmation of safety, orientation, and control. When that confirmation disappears, the brain is forced to rely on internal models rather than external evidence. In this condition, inherited fears, learned associations, and unresolved emotional patterns become easier to access. The mind fills the sensory vacuum with memory and expectation, and fear often emerges as the most conservative interpretation available. At night, darkness also coincides with biological transitions toward rest. As the brain prepares for sleep, control mechanisms loosen and attention turns inward. This transitional state is inherently unstable. Consciousness is neither fully engaged nor fully released. Fear can arise here not as a sign of danger, but as resistance to letting go. The brain, facing reduced sensory input and impending vulnerability, performs one last assessment of safety. If uncertainty remains, fear intensifies briefly, delaying full relaxation. Understanding why darkness triggers fear reframes the experience entirely. Fear in the dark is not childish, irrational, or outdated. It is the expression of a nervous system shaped by real conditions that no longer exist in the same form. Darkness signals uncertainty, and uncertainty activates protection. When the brain recognizes enough stability, fear gradually recedes on its own. Until then, it speaks not to frighten, but to ensure that nothing important has been overlooked before consciousness finally drifts toward rest. The unknown has always occupied a special place in the architecture of human fear. Unlike visible threats, the unknown cannot be measured, confronted, or resolved through direct action. It represents the absence of information, and for a brain evolved to survive by prediction, absence of information is itself a signal of risk. The human nervous system is not distressed by danger alone, it is distressed by uncertainty. When outcomes cannot be anticipated, the brain is forced to prepare for multiple possibilities at once, and fear emerges as the most efficient organizing response. It narrows attention, increases vigilance, and biases interpretation toward caution, allowing the organism to conserve resources while remaining prepared for sudden change. From an evolutionary standpoint, the unknown was rarely benign. Unexplored territory, unfamiliar sounds, or unexpected silence often preceded injury or death. Early humans who treated the unknown with indifference were less likely to survive than those who approached it with hesitation. Over time, the brain learned a simple rule: what cannot be predicted should be treated as potentially dangerous. This rule required no detailed analysis. It relied on probability accumulated over generations. The unknown became emotionally charged, not because it was always harmful, but because it was sometimes catastrophic, and the cost of ignoring it was too high. Neurologically, the fear of the unknown arises from the brain's dependence on predictive models. The brain is constantly generating expectations about what will happen next, comparing incoming sensory data to internal forecasts. When these forecasts fail or cannot be generated, prediction error increases. High prediction error is metabolically costly and destabilizing. Fear functions as a stabilizing response in these moments. It reduces exploratory behavior, limits unnecessary movement, and shifts the organism into a state of readiness. In essence, fear buys time when certainty is unavailable. At night, the unknown becomes more prominent because predictability decreases. Sensory input is reduced, visual confirmation disappears, and environmental cues become ambiguous. The brain, deprived of reliable data, turns inward to fill the gaps. Internal imagery, memories, and abstract possibilities take on greater significance. The mind may begin to anticipate scenarios rather than observe reality. In this state, the unknown does not remain abstract. It becomes emotionally tangible, even if no specific threat can be identified. Fear attaches itself not to an object, but to the absence of clarity itself. This is why nighttime fear often feels diffuse and difficult to articulate. There may be no clear reason, no specific danger, and no identifiable cause. The discomfort arises not from what is present, but from what is missing. The brain senses that it lacks sufficient information to guarantee safety, and it responds accordingly. The unknown is not experienced as emptiness, but as potential. And for a system optimized for survival, potential always includes the possibility of harm. The fear of the unknown also explains why the mind seeks certainty, even when certainty is unpleasant. Clear danger is often easier to tolerate than ambiguity because it allows the brain to focus its response. The unknown, by contrast, keeps multiple threat pathways partially active at once. This sustained low-level activation can feel more exhausting than acute fear. At night, when cognitive resources are reduced, the brain is less capable of managing this complexity. Fear intensifies, not because the unknown has grown, but because the mind's capacity to contain uncertainty has diminished. Understanding the fear of the unknown reveals that fear is not always a reaction to something external. Often, it is a reaction to the limits of knowledge itself. The brain is uncomfortable without a story, a pattern, or a prediction. When none is available, fear fills the gap, providing a temporary structure until clarity returns or consciousness fades into sleep. In this way, fear of the unknown is not a failure of courage or reason. It is the brain's most ancient response to a world that has always been only partially understood. Distraction is one of the most powerful regulators of fear in the modern human brain, even though it is rarely recognized as such. Throughout the day, attention is continuously pulled outward toward movement, conversation, tasks, light, sound, and structured goals. These inputs occupy cognitive resources and stabilize perception by providing constant feedback about the environment. As long as the brain is engaged with external demands, fear-related systems operate quietly in the background. They remain active, but they are masked. When distractions disappear, fear does not suddenly emerge. It simply loses its cover. From a neurobiological perspective, attention acts as a gatekeeper. What the brain attends to becomes amplified, while unattended signals fade into the background. During periods of activity, attention is anchored to predictable stimuli. At night, as external stimulation decreases, attention detaches from the environment and turns inward. This inward shift is not deliberate. It is a natural consequence of reduced sensory input and cognitive demand. When attention has nowhere external to settle, it begins scanning internal states, sensations, memories, emotions, and unresolved signals. Fear becomes more noticeable because it is one of the strongest signals available. The brain evolved in conditions where lack of stimulation often coincided with risk. Stillness and quiet were rarely neutral states in ancestral environments. They often meant isolation, exposure, or imminent danger. As a result, the brain learned to treat low stimulation conditions as meaningful. When nothing is happening, the system assumes something might be about to happen. Fear increases not because the brain enjoys anxiety, but because silence and inactivity historically required heightened readiness. Distraction, in this context, became a modern substitute for environmental safety cues. Cognitively, distractions suppress fear by engaging higher-order brain regions responsible for planning, problem-solving, and narrative thinking. These regions exert top-down control over emotional circuits, dampening their output. When distractions fade, this regulatory influence weakens. The emotional brain gains relative freedom. Thoughts become less structured, time feels less linear, and emotional associations link more freely. Fear thrives in this environment because it does not require structure or sequence. It emerges through sensation, memory fragments, and anticipation rather than through logical reasoning. At night, the absence of distraction also exposes unresolved cognitive material. During the day, the brain postpones processing certain emotional signals in order to function efficiently. These signals do not disappear, they are delayed. When activity slows, the backlog surfaces. Fear-related material often appears first because it carries high biological priority. The brain treats unresolved threat-related information as urgent, even if the threat is abstract or outdated. This can manifest as vague unease, sudden intrusive thoughts, or a sense of tension without clear cause. Importantly, the intensification of fear in low distraction states does not indicate that fear has grown stronger. It indicates that competing signals have weakened. Just as a quiet room makes subtle sounds more audible, a quiet mind makes subtle emotional signals more perceptible. Fear feels louder because the internal environment has become quieter. This distinction matters because it reframes the experience from escalation to exposure. Fear is not increasing, it is being revealed. This process is closely tied to the brain's preparation for sleep. As consciousness transitions toward rest, the mind releases structured control and allows associative networks to activate freely. This is a necessary step for memory consolidation and emotional regulation. Fear may arise during this transition as part of the brain's final assessment of internal and external conditions. If something feels unresolved or unpredictable, fear signals hesitation. Once sufficient stability is sensed, fear often subsides naturally without intervention. Understanding the relationship between distraction and fear shifts how nighttime anxiety is interpreted. Fear in quiet moments is not evidence of fragility or imbalance. It is evidence that the mind has stopped suppressing signals in order to perform. The absence of distraction allows the brain to surface what it has been holding beneath awareness. When this process is understood, fear loses some of its power, not because it is eliminated, but because it is recognized as a temporary byproduct of a mind transitioning from engagement to rest. Fear was never meant to dominate the mind indefinitely. Its function was always situational, temporary, and adaptive. It emerged to prompt action, increase awareness, or delay vulnerability until conditions were favorable. Once those conditions were met, fear was designed to recede. In the modern world, however, fear often lingers beyond its original purpose, not because the system is broken, but because the context in which it evolved has changed faster than the brain itself. Understanding when fear no longer serves its function requires recognizing the difference between biological signaling and modern interpretation. In ancestral environments, fear typically resolved itself through action. A threat appeared, the organism reacted, and the situation changed either through escape, confrontation, or avoidance. The feedback loop was short and clear. In contrast, many modern fears lack a direct behavioral resolution. Abstract concerns, imagined scenarios, and future-oriented uncertainties do not provide the brain with clear endpoints. The fear system remains partially active because it has not received confirmation that the threat has passed. Without resolution, fear becomes sustained rather than transient. At night, this unresolved state becomes more visible. The brain, preparing for sleep, begins to disengage from problem-solving and external control. In doing so, it reveals signals that were previously suppressed. Fear that no longer has a practical function surfaces not to demand action, but because it has nowhere else to go. It becomes experiential rather than directive. This shift often feels uncomfortable because fear is present without a clear instruction attached to it. The system is active, but its original purpose has dissolved. Neurologically, this moment represents a mismatch between signal and environment. The fear circuits activate based on probability and pattern, but the environment no longer confirms the need for response. Over time, higher cortical regions can learn to reinterpret these signals, but this learning is gradual and context-dependent. The brain does not simply turn off a system that once ensured survival. It waits for repeated evidence that the signal is no longer required. Until then, fear remains available, even if it is no longer useful. Importantly, fear begins to lose its intensity once it is no longer treated as an instruction. When the mind stops asking, "What should I do about this?" and instead observes, "This is a signal without a target," the system receives new feedback. The absence of reaction becomes informative. The brain learns that fear can exist without immediate consequence. This learning does not happen through force or suppression. It happens through exposure to safety while fear is present. As sleep approaches, this process often resolves naturally. Conscious control fades, the need for interpretation diminishes, and the brain shifts into states where fear has little influence. In these states, fear is neither fought nor followed. It is simply bypassed as attention dissolves. The system that once demanded vigilance recognizes that vigilance is no longer required. The signal quiets, not because it was silenced, but because it was understood. When fear loses its purpose, it does not disappear abruptly. It softens. It becomes less specific, less urgent, less convincing. The mind no longer orients around it. This is not the elimination of fear, but its integration into a broader awareness. The brain retains the capacity to generate fear when needed, but it no longer insists on its presence in conditions where it serves no function. In this way, fear's final role at night is paradoxical. By appearing without purpose, it reveals its own limits. It shows that it is a tool, not a truth. And once that distinction is felt rather than analyzed, the mind is free to move past vigilance and into rest, not because fear was defeated, but because it was no longer required. Fear is most easily understood when it is doing exactly what it was designed to do. At its core, fear is a regulatory signal that prepares the body for survival. It mobilizes energy, sharpens perception, and reorganizes attention around what matters most in uncertain conditions. When fear protects the body, it operates with clarity and direction. The sensation may be uncomfortable, but it is purposeful. The body knows what to do, even if the mind does not yet understand why. This alignment between signal and function represents fear in its original, adaptive form. Physiologically, protective fear triggers a coordinated response across multiple systems. The autonomic nervous system shifts toward readiness, increasing heart rate, redirecting blood flow to muscles, and heightening sensory sensitivity. Stress hormones are released not to cause distress, but to optimize performance. Pain perception may temporarily decrease, reaction time improves, and attention narrows to relevant cues. This state is metabolically expensive, which is why it is designed to be temporary. Fear protects by borrowing energy from the future to survive the present. In ancestral environments, this response increased survival probability dramatically. A sudden threat required immediate action, not contemplation. Fear compressed decision-making into instinctive movement. There was no need for explanation. The body responded first, and understanding came later, if at all. This sequence is still visible today. Fear often appears as a physical sensation before it becomes a conscious thought. The body moves toward protection automatically, reflecting a system optimized for speed rather than reflection. Even in modern life, fear continues to protect the body in subtle ways. It prevents dangerous risk-taking, signals when boundaries are being crossed, and draws attention to conditions that require caution. A moment of fear can interrupt automatic behavior, forcing re-evaluation. In this sense, fear acts as a brake rather than an accelerator. It slows the organism just enough to reassess potential consequences. When aligned with real-world conditions, this function remains valuable and necessary. The problem arises not when fear activates, but when its activation no longer matches the environment. The protective function depends on feedback. When action resolves uncertainty, fear subsides. The system completes its cycle. When feedback is absent or unclear, fear persists. At night, this distinction becomes especially important. The body is preparing for vulnerability during sleep, and fear performs one final protective scan. If conditions feel stable, fear diminishes. If not, it remains active, delaying rest. Understanding protective fear requires recognizing its temporal nature. Fear is not meant to be a permanent state. It is a transition. It bridges uncertainty until safety is restored. When fear is allowed to complete this role without resistance, it often resolves quickly. The discomfort passes because the system has achieved its goal. The body has prepared, assessed, and adjusted. There is nothing left for fear to do. This is why fear that protects the body often feels different from fear that lingers. Protective fear is sharp, brief, and directional. Lingering fear is diffuse, prolonged, and without clear instruction. The former reflects alignment between brain and environment. The latter reflects a mismatch. Recognizing this difference allows the mind to respond appropriately. Not all fear needs to be eliminated. Some fear simply needs to be allowed to finish what it started. As the night deepens and the body moves closer to sleep, protective fear gradually hands control back to restorative systems. Muscles relax, breathing slows, and vigilance decreases. The brain recognizes that immediate survival demands have been met. When fear has fulfilled its purpose, it recedes naturally, leaving behind not exhaustion, but readiness for rest. In this way, fear does not stand in opposition to sleep. When functioning correctly, it is one of the final processes that ensures sleep can occur safely. Fear becomes problematic, not because it exists, but because it continues after its original function has been fulfilled. In biological terms, a signal that no longer leads to action or resolution loses its usefulness. The fear system was designed to activate, guide behavior, and then stand down once safety was restored. In the modern human brain, however, this cycle is often interrupted. The environment no longer provides clear endpoints. threats are abstract, delayed, or hypothetical, and the brain is left holding a signal without a destination. Fear remains active, not because danger persists, but because the system has not received confirmation that it can safely disengage. This breakdown occurs largely because modern fears are rarely physical and rarely immediate. Concerns about the future, social evaluation, loss of control, or imagined outcomes do not resolve through movement or avoidance. The body prepares for action, but no action satisfies the signal. The nervous system enters a state of suspended readiness, where fear continues to circulate without release. This state is metabolically costly and cognitively draining. The brain is expending energy to solve a problem that has no physical solution, and over time, this mismatch produces exhaustion rather than protection. At night, this inefficiency becomes especially apparent. The brain transitions away from goal-directed thinking and toward restorative processes. When fear remains active during this transition, it no longer serves survival. Instead, it interferes with rest. The body remains alert when it should be disengaging. Muscles stay subtly tense, breathing remains shallow, and attention stays partially anchored to threat monitoring. Fear has lost its timing. It is active in a phase where action is neither possible nor required. Neurologically, this represents a failure of context updating. The fear circuits continue to respond as if the environment were uncertain or dangerous, even when repeated evidence suggests otherwise. This persistence is not stubbornness. It reflects the brain's conservative bias. Evolution favored systems that delayed deactivation until safety was overwhelmingly clear. In ancestral environments, premature relaxation could be fatal. In modern environments, this caution can outlast its usefulness. Importantly, fear does not stop being useful because it is unpleasant. It stops being useful when it no longer informs behavior. Once fear ceases to guide meaningful action, it becomes noise rather than signal. The brain does not always recognize this distinction immediately. It continues to treat fear as instruction until new learning occurs. This learning requires exposure to safety without engagement. The nervous system must experience that nothing happens even when fear is present. At night, this learning opportunity appears naturally, as the mind stops trying to solve fear and instead allows it to exist without response. The system receives new information. Fear is present, but no harm follows. Over time, this weakens the association between fear and urgency. The brain learns that the signal does not require action in this context. This is how fear gradually loses influence, not through suppression, but through irrelevance. Understanding when fear stops being useful changes the relationship with it entirely. Fear is no longer treated as an enemy or a problem to be eliminated. It is treated as outdated information. The brain is allowed to update its predictions based on current conditions rather than ancestral probability. This process is slow, but it is biologically sound. It respects the system rather than fighting it. As this update occurs, fear begins to soften on its own. It does not disappear dramatically. It fades as attention disengages and the body shifts toward restoration. The nervous system recognizes that vigilance is no longer required. When fear loses its usefulness, it naturally gives way to stillness, not because it was forced out, but because it no longer has anything left to do. For fear to truly release its grip, the brain must learn something more powerful than reassurance. It must learn safety through experience. Safety is not an abstract idea to the nervous system. It is a pattern, a repeated outcome, a reliable absence of harm across time. The brain does not relax because it is told to relax. It relaxes because its predictions stop being contradicted by reality. When feared outcomes fail to occur again and again, especially in states of low control such as rest or sleep, the brain slowly updates its internal models. This learning is gradual, conservative, and deeply biological. Safety learning occurs through exposure without consequence. When fear arises and nothing follows, the nervous system receives new data. Initially, this data is weak compared to the weight of ancestral probability. One safe night does not overwrite thousands of years of survival bias, but repetition matters. Each time the brain detects fear and observes that no action is required, the association between fear and urgency weakens slightly. This process is subtle and often unnoticed, but over time it reshapes emotional responses more effectively than conscious effort ever could. At night, this learning process becomes especially potent because the brain is already in a state of lowered control. As higher cognitive functions disengage, the nervous system is forced to rely on direct experience rather than interpretation. The body lies still, the environment remains unchanged. Fear may arise, but no danger appears. In this quiet repetition, the brain receives a powerful signal. Vigilance did not change the outcome. Gradually, the system begins to conserve energy rather than spend it on unnecessary alertness. This is why attempts to aggressively eliminate fear often backfire. Struggling against fear keeps attention locked onto it, reinforcing its perceived importance. The brain interprets resistance as confirmation that something significant is happening. In contrast, allowing fear to exist without response deprives it of reinforcement. The signal is present, but it no longer controls behavior. This non-engagement is not passive surrender. It is a form of learning that tells the nervous system, through experience, that fear is no longer predictive. Over time, the brain begins to distinguish between threat and sensation. Fear becomes recognized as an internal state rather than an external warning. This distinction is critical. Once fear is categorized as sensation, its authority diminishes. The body may still feel tension or alertness, but the mind no longer orients around it. The signal is reclassified. It is no longer treated as instruction. This reclassification is what allows fear to fade without force. As safety learning accumulates, the brain's default nighttime state shifts. What once triggered vigilance begins to trigger neutrality. Darkness, silence, and stillness lose their emotional charge. They become cues for rest rather than uncertainty. This transition does not require conscious effort. It emerges naturally as the nervous system recalibrates based on lived experience. The brain is not stubborn, it is cautious. When evidence is sufficient, it adapts. In this way, fear does not disappear because it is defeated. It disappears because it becomes unnecessary. The brain, having learned that nothing needs to be done, redirects energy toward restoration. Breathing slows, muscles release, and attention dissolves. Safety is not declared, it is felt. And when safety is felt, fear has no remaining role to play, allowing the mind to move gently and effortlessly towards sleep. There comes a point in the night when fear does not end abruptly, but slowly loses its structure. It does not disappear through confrontation or resolution. It dissolves because the conditions that sustained it no longer exist. The brain, having scanned the environment repeatedly and found no change, begins to withdraw energy from vigilance. This withdrawal is not a conscious decision. It is a biological reallocation of resources. Systems that were once prioritized for survival gradually yield control to systems responsible for repair, integration, and rest. In this phase, fear does not vanish. It becomes diffuse. Its sharp edges soften. Thoughts that once carried urgency lose momentum. Sensations that demanded attention begin to fade into the background. The brain no longer treats fear as a message requiring interpretation. Instead, it registers it as residual activity, neural momentum from a system that has completed its task. This is a critical distinction. Fear dissolves not because it was answered, but because it no longer needs to speak. Neurologically, this transition reflects a shift in dominance from arousal networks to restorative networks. The brain reduces stress hormone output, parasympathetic activity increases, and neural oscillations slow. Attention fragments rather than focusing sharply. The mind stops constructing narratives around fear and allows experience to drift. In this drifting state, fear has little traction. It cannot organize thought because thought itself is becoming less structured. Consciousness loosens its grip, and with it, fear loses its audience. This process often unfolds beneath awareness. People do not notice the exact moment fear dissolves because noticing requires alertness, and alertness is already fading. What remains is a vague sense of heaviness, warmth, or distance from thought. The mind is still present, but it is no longer invested in monitoring outcomes. The future ceases to matter. The past loses relevance. Fear, which depends on anticipation and memory, finds no framework in which to operate. Importantly, this dissolution does not require trust, belief, or effort. It requires only time spent in non-reactivity. The brain learns through repetition that fear does not alter outcomes during rest. Each night that ends in sleep reinforces this learning. Gradually, fear begins to anticipate its own irrelevance in these conditions. It activates less strongly, withdraws more quickly, and eventually appears only faintly before dissolving altogether. In this state, rest does not feel earned. It feels inevitable. The body settles not because it was convinced to do so, but because nothing remains to keep it alert. Muscles release tension without instruction. Breathing deepens without control. Thought fragments lose coherence and drift away. Fear has not been silenced. It has been outgrown by a system that no longer requires its input. This is the natural conclusion of fear's nightly cycle. It begins as vigilance, shifts into presence, and ends as absence. Not absence of sensation, but absence of demand. The brain no longer asks anything of consciousness. It no longer waits for permission to rest. And in that quiet release, fear completes its final function, not by protecting the body, but by stepping aside so restoration can begin. As night deepens, the experience of fear is no longer driven primarily by thought or memory, but by chemistry. The brain begins a gradual transition from a state optimized for action to a state optimized for restoration. And this transition is governed by shifts in neurochemistry rather than conscious intent. Hormones, neurotransmitters, and neuromodulators change their balance slowly, guiding perception, emotion, and arousal towards sleep. Fear, which relies on certain chemical conditions to maintain intensity, begins to lose its biochemical support as these shifts unfold. One of the most important changes involves stress-related chemistry. During the day, cortisol and related hormones help maintain alertness, energy availability, and responsiveness to challenge. These substances are not inherently harmful. They are essential for functioning in a demanding environment. At night, however, their continued presence becomes counterproductive. The brain begins to reduce their release, signaling that sustained vigilance is no longer required. As cortisol levels fall, the physiological intensity of fear diminishes. The body becomes less prepared for action, and emotional signals lose some of their urgency. At the same time, substances associated with rest and inhibition begin to rise. Melatonin increases, not only to regulate sleep timing, but to alter the brain's overall sensitivity to stimulation. Melatonin dampens neural reactivity, making it harder for sudden thoughts or sensations to trigger full emotional responses. GABA, the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, becomes more influential, reducing background neural noise and slowing the pace of mental activity. Fear, which depends on rapid excitation and amplification, struggles to maintain momentum in this chemical environment. This chemical shift does not eliminate fear instantly. Instead, it changes how fear is experienced. The sharp, activating quality of fear gives way to a softer, heavier sensation. Thoughts may still appear, but they lack the same emotional charge. Worries feel distant rather than immediate. The brain is no longer chemically primed to treat fear as instruction. It registers the signal, but it does not amplify it. This distinction marks the beginning of fear's chemical disengagement. Importantly, this process unfolds even when the mind is unaware of it. The brain does not wait for reassurance or understanding to change its chemistry. It follows circadian rhythms that evolved long before conscious reflection played any role in emotional regulation. These rhythms are synchronized with darkness, stillness, and reduced sensory input. When conditions align, chemistry shifts regardless of whether fear is present. This is why fear can suddenly feel weaker without any clear mental reason. The system supporting it has quietly stepped back. The chemistry of the night brain also reduces the brain's capacity to sustain complex emotional narratives. Neurotransmitter balance shifts away from systems that support focused attention and sustained thought. As a result, fear loses its storyline. It may still exist as sensation, but it can no longer organize itself into convincing explanations or future scenarios. The mind drifts, not because it chooses to, but because the chemical environment no longer supports narrative continuity. Over repeated nights, this chemical pattern teaches the brain an important lesson. Fear that arises at night does not persist indefinitely. It fades as chemistry changes. This repeated fading becomes part of the brain's expectation. The nervous system learns that nighttime fear is temporary, self-limiting, and unnecessary to maintain. Gradually, fear activates less strongly in anticipation of its own chemical irrelevance. In this way, the chemistry of the night does not fight fear. It outlasts it. The brain does not argue with fear or attempt to suppress it. It simply changes the conditions under which fear operates. As those conditions shift, fear loses its biological support and recedes naturally, allowing the mind to move deeper into rest without force, effort, or resistance. Melatonin is often described simply as a sleep hormone, but this description dramatically understates its influence on the human brain. Melatonin does not force sleep, nor does it directly shut consciousness down. Instead, it reshapes the internal environment in which thought, emotion, and attention operate. As melatonin levels rise during the night, the brain becomes less reactive, less urgent, and less inclined to interpret signals as threats. Fear, which depends on sharp reactivity and rapid amplification, begins to lose the conditions it needs to remain convincing. Unlike stimulatory neurochemicals that push the brain toward action, melatonin works by gently lowering the gain on neural circuits. It reduces sensitivity to incoming stimuli, both external and internal. Sounds feel farther away, thoughts feel slower. Emotional reactions lose their edge. This is not sedation, it is modulation. The brain remains awake, but its thresholds change. Signals that would have triggered alarm earlier in the day now pass through the system with less impact. Fear does not disappear, but it struggles to rise above background awareness. One of melatonin's most important effects is its influence on attention. As levels increase, sustained focus becomes more difficult. The mind drifts naturally, not because of fatigue alone, but because the neurochemical environment no longer supports prolonged engagement with any single idea. Fear relies heavily on sustained attention to maintain itself. It needs the mind to stay with it, to revisit it, to elaborate it. When attention slips, fear loses coherence. It cannot hold its shape without cognitive reinforcement. Melatonin also interacts with emotional memory. As it rises, the brain becomes less inclined to retrieve emotionally charged material in a detailed or vivid form. Memories lose sharpness and emotional intensity. Fear-based recollections may still surface, but they do so as fragments rather than full narratives. This fragmentation weakens fear's persuasive power. Without a clear story to attach itself to, fear becomes an indistinct sensation rather than a compelling experience. Importantly, melatonin does not discriminate between useful and unnecessary fear. It dampens reactivity across the board. This broad effect is precisely what makes it effective at night. The brain is no longer prioritizing survival decisions. It is prioritizing restoration. In this context, even biologically meaningful fear signals are treated with reduced urgency. The system assumes that action is unlikely and unnecessary during rest, and chemistry adjusts accordingly. This chemical softening also alters time perception. As melatonin increases, the sense of urgency tied to future outcomes weakens. Fear often derives its power from imagined futures, what might happen, what could go wrong. When the brain's ability to project forward diminishes, fear loses one of its primary supports. The future becomes vague, distant, and emotionally neutral. Without a compelling future scenario to react to, fear gradually disengages. Over repeated nights, the brain learns to associate melatonin's rise with emotional quieting. Fear that appears earlier in the evening is repeatedly followed by a period of softening and release. This pattern becomes predictive. Eventually, fear activates less strongly because the brain anticipates its own chemical downregulation. The system learns that fear at night is temporary and self-resolving. In this way, Melatonin does not eliminate fear through suppression or control. It dissolves fear indirectly by changing the conditions that allow it to dominate attention and emotion. The mind does not need to stop fearing. It simply needs to stop being chemically capable of sustaining fear. And as melatonin continues to rise, the mind naturally drifts toward a state where fear has nothing left to hold on to, allowing rest to unfold without effort. As the night progresses, another quiet but powerful shift takes place deep within the brain. Inhibitory systems begin to dominate over excitatory ones. Central to this transition is GABA, the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. Unlike chemicals that stimulate action or heighten alertness, GABA's role is to reduce neural firing, slow communication between circuits, and prevent runaway activity. Fear, which relies on rapid excitation and feedback loops, becomes increasingly difficult to sustain in an environment where inhibition is rising. GABA does not eliminate thoughts or emotions directly. Instead, it changes the speed and intensity with which neural signals propagate. When GABAergic activity increases, neurons require stronger input to fire. This raises the threshold for emotional amplification. Signals that might have cascaded into full fear responses earlier in the day now dissipate before gaining momentum. The brain still registers information, but it does so with restraint. Fear may appear as a faint sensation or brief image, but it lacks the neural support to expand into urgency or distress. This inhibitory influence is especially important at night because the brain is transitioning away from states that favor rapid decision-making. During the day, excitatory systems dominate, allowing quick responses, sustained attention, and emotional intensity. At night, those same properties become liabilities. The brain does not need to react quickly. It needs to disengage safely. GABA provides the chemical means to accomplish this by dampening activity across wide regions of the cortex, including areas involved in threat detection and emotional evaluation. As GABA's influence spreads, the brain's internal dialogue begins to fragment. Thoughts lose continuity. Emotional narratives break apart before reaching conclusion. Fear, which often depends on sustained chains of thought, anticipation, interpretation, projection, cannot maintain its structure. Each component of fear appears briefly and then dissolves. The system lacks the excitatory reinforcement needed to bind sensations into a coherent emotional experience. This process is not passive, it is an active form of regulation. The brain is deliberately inhibiting its own capacity for arousal in preparation for sleep. GABAergic neurons act as brakes, preventing unnecessary activation and protecting the system from overstimulation. Fear circuits are not singled out. They are simply subject to the same inhibitory environment as everything else. The result is a generalized quieting that makes intense emotional states increasingly unlikely. Importantly, this inhibitory shift also alters how the brain relates to internal sensations. Bodily signals such as tension, heartbeat, or subtle discomfort are perceived with less interpretive urgency. The mind notices them without reacting strongly. Fear often arises when sensations are interpreted as signals of danger. When interpretation slows and inhibition increases, sensations lose their meaning. They are felt, but not evaluated. This decoupling weakens fear at its foundation. Over repeated nights, the brain learns to associate this inhibitory state with safety. GABA-mediated quieting becomes a predictable phase of the circadian cycle. Fear that appears earlier in the evening is consistently followed by a period of neural dampening. This pattern teaches the nervous system that fear does not require sustained attention at night. Gradually, the threshold for fear activation rises and its duration shortens. In this way, GABA does not fight fear or suppress it through force. It renders fear inefficient. The neural environment becomes inhospitable to prolonged arousal. Fear is still possible, but it cannot dominate. It cannot organize the mind or command behavior. It becomes a transient signal that fades as inhibition deepens, allowing the brain to move steadily toward the slow, synchronized activity that characterizes deep rest and sleep. As the night reaches its later phases, the brain's chemistry no longer supports fear as an organizing force. What remains is not the absence of emotion, but a profound change in how emotion is constructed and experienced. Fear, like all emotional states, is not a single substance or location in the brain. It is a pattern, an alignment of chemistry, neural timing, and attention. When that alignment dissolves, fear loses its coherence. It does not vanish suddenly. It becomes unrecognizable as the experience it once was. By this stage of the night, multiple chemical processes converge. Stress-related hormones have declined significantly. Inhibitory systems dominate neural signaling, and circadian regulators have shifted the brain towards synchronization rather than responsiveness. Emotional signals still arise, but they do so in a fundamentally different environment. Without chemical reinforcement, fear cannot maintain intensity, narrative, or urgency. It fragments into sensations that no longer point anywhere. The brain registers activity, but it does not interpret it as meaningful threat. This chemical rewriting alters emotional memory in real time. Experiences that would have been emotionally charged earlier in the day lose their grip. The brain is no longer prioritizing memory retrieval based on relevance to survival. Instead, it favors consolidation and integration. Emotional content is softened, stripped of urgency, and reorganized into long-term storage. Fear-based memories lose their sharp edges, becoming less vivid and less intrusive. The mind is not erasing fear, it is recontextualizing it. Crucially, this transformation does not require insight or understanding. The brain does not need to know that fear is unnecessary in order to release it. Chemistry does the work automatically. As neurotransmitter balance shifts, emotional appraisal systems lose influence. The mind becomes less evaluative and more receptive. Sensations drift through awareness without triggering interpretation. This state feels neither anxious nor calm in the usual sense. It feels neutral, distant, and quietly absorbing. At this point, fear no longer competes for attention because attention itself is dissolving. The brain's capacity to hold focus diminishes, and with it, the ability to sustain emotional states. Thoughts appear briefly and then fade. Emotional tones arise and then flatten. Fear cannot persist without continuity, and continuity is precisely what the night brain is losing. Consciousness loosens its structure, and fear slips through the cracks. Over time, repeated exposure to this chemical quieting changes how fear is anticipated. The nervous system learns that nighttime fear does not escalate indefinitely. It learns that chemistry will intervene. This expectation alters future responses. Fear may still appear earlier in the evening, but it arrives with less authority. The brain knows, at a level deeper than thought, that fear will be rewritten by the night. This knowledge reduces urgency before it even forms. In the final stages before sleep, emotional experience becomes diffuse and unbound. The brain is no longer organizing reality around threats or goals. It is organizing around restoration. Fear, which once guided action and attention, finds no role here. There is nothing to prepare for, nothing to resolve, nothing to monitor. The system that once demanded vigilance now withdraws completely, not because it has been silenced, but because the conditions that gave it meaning no longer exist. This is how chemistry completes what understanding alone cannot. Fear does not need to be confronted, explained, or removed. It needs to be outgrown by a brain that has shifted into a different mode of operation. As the night deepens and chemistry settles, fear dissolves into a background hum that soon fades entirely. What remains is not emptiness, but a steady, neutral field of awareness, one that allows consciousness to finally let go and drift into sleep. As the brain moves closer to sleep, one of the most profound changes occurs not in thought content, but in timing. Neural activity begins to slow, reorganizing itself into rhythms that are fundamentally incompatible with urgency. During the day, the waking brain operates largely in faster frequencies, supporting rapid information processing, focused attention, and immediate reaction. These fast rhythms allow fear to escalate quickly, linking sensations to thoughts and thoughts to action. At night, however, this temporal structure begins to dissolve. Brainwaves slow, synchronize, and stretch across wider regions of the cortex, reshaping how experience itself is constructed. This slowing is not subtle. As beta activity fades and alpha and theta rhythms become more dominant, the brain's capacity to maintain sharp distinctions weakens. Thoughts no longer arrive in quick succession. Emotional responses no longer stack on top of one another. Instead, experience becomes elongated, diffuse, and less directional. Fear depends on speed. It requires rapid evaluation, quick escalation, and tight coupling between stimulus and response. When neural timing slows, fear loses its most important advantage: momentum. In slower brain states, signals take longer to propagate and are more likely to dissipate before triggering secondary responses. A fearful thought may arise, but it does not immediately recruit supporting sensations, images, and narratives. By the time the system could amplify it, the signal has already weakened. The brain is no longer optimized for chaining reactions together. Each moment becomes more self-contained. Fear cannot easily leap from one moment to the next, and without continuity, it cannot sustain itself. This change in timing also alters how the brain perceives importance. In fast states, the brain prioritizes what demands immediate response. In slow states, urgency loses meaning. Everything feels less pressing, not because problems are solved, but because the neural machinery required to treat them as urgent is offline. Fear may still be present as a concept, but it no longer feels actionable. The body does not prepare, attention does not narrow. The system simply registers the signal and moves on. As neural rhythms slow further, synchronization increases. Large populations of neurons begin firing together rather than independently. This collective timing reduces internal conflict. Competing signals, fear, memory, sensation merge into a unified background rather than vying for dominance. Fear cannot stand out against this synchronized field. It becomes one fluctuation among many, indistinguishable from other passing mental events. The brain is no longer organized around problem solving. It is organized around coherence. This rhythmic shift also disrupts the brain's ability to simulate the future. Fast oscillations support projection, planning, and anticipation. Slower oscillations favor presence without prediction. Fear relies heavily on imagined futures, what could happen, what might go wrong. When the brain's timing no longer supports forward simulation, fear loses its narrative fuel. The future becomes inaccessible, and without a future to warn about, fear has nothing left to say. Importantly, this slowing does not require the absence of fear to begin. It occurs regardless of emotional state. The brain does not wait for calm before changing its rhythms. It changes its rhythms according to circadian timing and internal regulation. Fear that arises during this transition is carried along by the slowing process rather than amplified by it. The system that once supported vigilance is being dismantled piece by piece, replaced by one that favors integration and rest. In this state, urgency collapses, not because threats are evaluated and dismissed, but because the brain is no longer capable of sustaining urgency at all. Experience stretches, attention softens, and emotional intensity flattens. Fear becomes temporally incompatible with the brain's mode of operation. It cannot survive in slow time, and as neural rhythms continue to decelerate, fear fades not as a solved problem, but as a signal that has lost the temporal structure it needs to exist. As brain activity continues to slow, another fundamental transformation takes place. Thought itself begins to lose its fragmented, segmented structure. During waking hours, the mind operates by separation. One thought leads to another, each distinct, each evaluated, compared, and judged. Fear thrives in this fragmentation because it can attach itself to individual thoughts, isolate them, and amplify their significance. At night, as neural rhythms decelerate, this structure weakens. Thoughts no longer stand apart as discrete units. They begin to blur, overlap, and dissolve into a more unified field of experience. This unification is not the absence of thought, but a change in how thought is organized. Instead of linear sequences, the mind shifts toward a continuous flow. Images, sensations, and impressions arise without clear boundaries. Fear struggles in this environment because it depends on distinction. It requires a clear separation between me and threat, between now and what might happen. When these boundaries soften, fear loses its reference points. It can no longer position itself as a warning about something specific. Neurologically, this shift reflects increased coherence across large-scale brain networks. Regions that once competed for attention begin to synchronize. The brain stops switching rapidly between tasks, memories, and evaluations. This reduction in switching reduces cognitive tension. Fear often emerges in the gaps between competing mental states, feeding on inconsistency and unresolved comparison. When the mind becomes unified, there are fewer gaps to exploit. Experience becomes smoother, less jagged, and less reactive. In this unified state, attention no longer locks onto individual thoughts. It floats. A fearful idea may surface, but it is immediately absorbed into the broader field of awareness. There is no sharp focus to hold it in place. Without focus, fear cannot build intensity. It becomes one texture among many rather than a central theme. The mind does not reject it. It simply does not isolate it. This lack of isolation is what weakens fear most effectively. This process also alters self-perception. Fragmented thought reinforces a strong sense of individual identity, an observer evaluating threats from a distance. Unified experience softens this identity. The sense of a separate self becomes less defined. Fear, which relies on protecting a clearly bounded self, loses relevance when that boundary fades. The brain is no longer organizing experience around defense of identity. It is organizing around continuity and integration. As night deepens, this unification becomes more pronounced. The mind stops asking questions and stops demanding answers. Curiosity and concern both diminish. What remains is a steady awareness without commentary. Fear cannot persist without commentary. It requires interpretation, labeling, and meaning-making. When these processes slow, fear becomes mute. It is present only as a faint residue, no longer capable of directing attention or shaping experience. Over time, the brain learns that this unified state is safe. Each night that ends in rest reinforces the association between mental unification and absence of harm. The nervous system gradually anticipates this transition and allows it to unfold more easily. Fear arises earlier and fades faster, recognizing that fragmentation will soon give way to coherence. In this way, the movement from fragmented thought to unified experience represents a critical threshold. It is the point at which fear stops being an organizing principle of the mind. Experience is no longer divided into threats and responses. It becomes whole, and in wholeness, fear has no structure to inhabit, allowing the mind to continue its descent toward deeper, quieter states of rest. As brain rhythms continue to slow and synchronize, one of the most subtle yet transformative changes occurs in the perception of time. During waking consciousness, time is experienced as pressure. Moments feel limited, sequences feel urgent, and the future constantly intrudes upon the present. Fear depends heavily on this structure. It borrows its intensity from time: what might happen next, what could unfold if action is not taken, what lies just ahead. When time loses its sharp edges, fear loses its primary source of energy. In slower neural states, the brain's ability to segment experience into before and after begins to weaken. Events no longer feel as though they are moving toward an outcome. Instead, they appear suspended, floating without direction. The sense of progression fades. This does not mean the brain stops processing information. It means that processing is no longer organized around anticipation. Fear requires anticipation to exist. Without a clearly defined future to warn about, fear becomes unanchored. Neurologically, this shift reflects reduced activity in systems responsible for temporal prediction and sequencing. These systems are highly active during goal-directed behavior, where outcomes matter and timing is critical. At night, as the need for action disappears, these predictive systems disengage. The brain stops projecting forward. Thoughts no longer rush toward conclusions. Emotional states no longer escalate toward resolution. Everything slows into a continuous present where urgency cannot survive. This collapse of temporal structure profoundly alters emotional experience. Fear often feels intense because it compresses imagined futures into the present moment. It brings possible outcomes forward and treats them as immediate. When time perception flattens, this compression becomes impossible. The future recedes into abstraction. Fear may still reference it, but the reference lacks weight. It feels hypothetical rather than pressing. The mind acknowledges the thought without responding to it. As time loses definition, memory also changes. Past experiences lose their sharp emotional imprint. They are no longer retrieved as events with consequences, but as impressions without demand. Fear-based memories, which rely on the emotional continuity between past and future, lose their relevance. They no longer instruct behavior, they become neutral data rather than warnings. This temporal flattening also weakens the sense of control. During the day, the mind is constantly adjusting behavior based on expected outcomes. At night, when outcomes no longer matter, control dissolves. Fear, which often arises from the need to control or prevent future harm, finds no foothold. The brain is no longer negotiating with time, it is simply existing within it. Importantly, this loss of temporal grip does not feel disorienting in the night brain, it feels relieving. The constant demand to anticipate, plan, and prepare fades. Experience becomes self-contained. Each moment stands alone, complete without reference to what comes next. Fear cannot survive in isolated moments. It needs continuity, escalation, and consequence. When those elements dissolve, fear becomes inert. As this state deepens, the mind stops monitoring duration altogether. Minutes lose meaning. Awareness drifts without markers. In this timeless state, fear has no direction in which to move. It cannot warn, cannot urge, cannot accelerate. It simply fades into the background of experience, no longer distinct enough to command attention. This is one of the final transitions before sleep fully takes hold. The mind releases time, and with it, the mechanisms that sustain fear. What remains is a steady, unpressured awareness that no longer orients around past or future. In this state, rest does not feel like something that happens next. It feels like something that is already happening. At a certain depth of the night, fear reaches a threshold it cannot cross. It does not disappear because it has been resolved, nor because the mind has argued it away. It disappears because the brain has entered a mode in which fear is no longer capable of organizing experience. Organization is the key word. Fear requires structure, a center of attention, a sense of self to protect, a future to warn about, and a sequence of thoughts to amplify. When these elements dissolve, fear loses not just intensity, but relevance. By this stage, neural activity has slowed and synchronized to the point where experience is no longer divided into meaningful categories. Sensation, thought, and emotion blend into a continuous field. The brain is no longer parsing experience into signals that demand response. It is integrating. In this integrative mode, nothing stands out long enough to become dominant. Fear may arise as a faint signal, but it cannot recruit attention, cannot escalate, and cannot persist. It appears and vanishes without leaving a trace. This loss of organization also affects the sense of identity. During waking life, fear often centers on the self. What might happen to me, what I must avoid, what I must control. As sleep approaches, the boundaries of self-perception soften. The mind stops reinforcing the distinction between observer and experience. When the sense of a separate self weakens, fear loses its target. There is no clearly defined entity to protect. Without a protected center, fear has no function. Neurologically, This reflects reduced activity in networks responsible for self-referential processing. These networks normally anchor experience around personal relevance. As they quiet, experience becomes impersonal and diffuse. Events are no longer evaluated in terms of consequence or threat. They simply occur and pass. Fear, which depends on evaluation, cannot survive in a state where evaluation has ceased. At this depth, attention no longer moves deliberately. It drifts. There is no effort to focus and no resistance to distraction. The mind does not cling to thoughts or sensations. Everything is allowed to arise and fade naturally. Fear cannot persist without resistance or engagement. It needs the mind to return to it, to check it, to question it. When the mind stops doing these things, fear fades through neglect rather than suppression. This state is often experienced not as sleep itself, but as the final doorway before sleep. Awareness is still present, but it is no longer invested. There is a sense of distance from thought, as if experience is happening far away. Emotional tone flattens into neutrality. Fear, which relies on emotional contrast, cannot differentiate itself in this landscape. It blends into the background and dissolves. Importantly, this dissolution is gentle. There is no struggle, no dramatic release. Fear does not exit. It simply fails to reappear. The brain has shifted into a mode where fear has nothing to work with. No urgency, no narrative, no future, no self to defend. The system that once elevated fear as a priority has shut down its organizing framework. In this final stage, the mind is no longer preparing for anything. It is no longer monitoring safety or scanning uncertainty. Restoration has taken precedence over vigilance. Fear, having completed every role it could possibly serve, steps aside without announcement. What remains is a quiet continuity of experience that soon gives way to sleep, not as an event, but as a gradual disappearance of the need to experience anything at all. As the brain moves beyond vigilance and toward restoration, fear enters a phase that is less about reaction and more about reorganization. During the night, the brain does not simply shut down emotional systems. It actively revisits, reshapes, and redistributes them. Memory becomes the primary medium through which this process occurs. Fear, which has been tightly linked to memory throughout evolution, is gradually disentangled from the urgency that once defined it. What was once a signal for immediate action becomes material for integration. Memory at night behaves differently than memory during the day. In waking life, memories are retrieved to guide behavior, solve problems, or anticipate outcomes. At night, memory retrieval is no longer goal-oriented. Instead, it becomes associative and diffuse. Experiences, sensations, and emotional tones are revisited without the need to act on them. Fear-related memories surface not to warn, but to be reorganized. The brain is reviewing its internal archive, determining what still matters and what no longer requires attention. This rebalancing process weakens fear by changing its context. Fear during the day is embedded in narratives of cause and consequence. At night, those narratives dissolve. Memories lose their linear structure and emotional sharpness. A fearful experience may reappear as an image, a sensation, or a vague emotional trace rather than a complete story. Without narrative continuity, fear loses authority. It is no longer a command, it is a fragment. Neurologically, this reflects a shift from retrieval to consolidation. The brain is no longer asking how a memory should influence behavior. It is asking how that memory fits into the broader structure of experience. Emotional intensity is reduced so that memories can be stored without overwhelming the system. Fear-based memories, which were once prioritized for rapid access, are gradually redistributed into long-term storage where they carry less immediate weight. This nighttime rebalancing also changes how the brain evaluates emotional relevance. Signals that once demanded attention are compared against a larger internal context. Many fears, when viewed without urgency, lose significance. The brain recognizes patterns that no longer predict harm. This recognition does not occur consciously. It emerges as a quiet recalibration. Fear does not need to be disproven. It needs to be placed. As this process unfolds, the emotional charge associated with fear diminishes naturally. The body no longer prepares for action. Sensations associated with fear become neutral bodily states rather than warnings. The brain stops reinforcing the connection between memory and arousal. Over repeated nights, this decoupling becomes stronger. Fearful memories remain accessible, but they no longer dominate experience. Importantly, this rebalancing does not erase fear from memory. It refines it. The brain retains the information while releasing the urgency. This distinction is crucial. Fear becomes knowledge rather than alarm. It is stored as understanding instead of anticipation. When fear reaches this state, it no longer disrupts rest. It becomes part of the background structure of experience, available if needed, but no longer intrusive. In this way, the night does not fight fear, it absorbs it. Through memory reorganization, emotional softening, and contextual integration, fear is transformed from a signal into a memory that no longer needs to speak. The brain completes its quiet work without effort or awareness, leaving the mind lighter, less reactive, and increasingly prepared to let consciousness finally dissolve into sleep. As nighttime processing deepens, the brain begins to separate emotion from memory in a way that is rarely possible during waking life. During the day, memory and emotion are tightly bound. Experiences are recalled together with the physiological and emotional states that accompanied them. Fear, in particular, is remembered not only as information but as a bodily condition, tension, alertness, urgency. At night, this bond loosens. The brain retrieves memories without fully reactivating the emotional chemistry that once made them powerful. What remains is content without charge. This separation is not accidental. It is a core function of sleep-related processing. The brain recognizes that emotional intensity is useful only when it informs action. When action is no longer possible or required, intensity becomes a liability. Nighttime memory processing strips experiences of their urgency so they can be stored without destabilizing the system. Fearful memories are not erased, they are neutralized. The brain keeps the lesson but releases the alarm. Neurologically, this process involves a shift in how emotional circuits interact with memory networks. Regions that once amplified fear signals reduce their influence, while systems responsible for contextual integration take precedence. Memories are replayed in a quieter chemical environment, one that does not support strong emotional responses. This allows the brain to reassess past experiences without re-entering the state in which they were originally formed. Fear loses its immediacy because the body is no longer participating in the recall. As emotional weight decreases, memories become more abstract. They are no longer relived, they are observed. A situation that once triggered intense fear may appear only as a faint image or conceptual outline. The brain retains the information, what happened, what mattered, but discards the emotional force that once made the memory disruptive. This transformation is subtle and often unnoticed, yet it has lasting effects on how fear is experienced in the future. Over repeated nights, this process gradually reshapes emotional responses. Fearful memories that were once easily triggered begin to feel distant. The brain learns that recalling them does not require physiological arousal. This learning reduces reactivity during waking hours as well. Fear still exists, but it is less likely to hijack attention or bodily state. It becomes proportional rather than overwhelming. This nighttime decoupling also explains why emotional insights often feel clearer after sleep. The mind can reflect on experiences without being overwhelmed by how they once felt. Fear loses its power to distort perception. The brain gains perspective not through reasoning, but through chemistry. Emotional distance allows integration. What once felt threatening becomes understandable. What once demanded avoidance becomes knowledge. Importantly, this process does not rely on conscious effort. The brain performs this recalibration automatically. There is no need to analyze or reinterpret fear deliberately. The night brain does the work quietly, replaying, softening, and reorganizing emotional memory until it fits comfortably within the larger structure of experience. Fear is no longer a force that intrudes. It becomes a memory that informs without disturbing. In this state, emotional memory exists without emotional weight. The brain has achieved a balance that waking consciousness rarely allows. Experiences are preserved, but they no longer command the present moment. Fear has been transformed from an active signal into stored understanding, leaving the mind calmer, clearer, and ready to move fully into rest. As the night advances further, the brain completes a crucial transformation. Fear is no longer processed as something happening now, but as something that has already happened. This shift is subtle yet profound. Fear moves from the realm of lived experience into the realm of information. It stops being felt and starts being known. The difference between these two states is the difference between being inside an emotion and observing it from a distance. At this stage, the brain no longer treats fear as a present moment signal requiring attention. It treats it as data useful, stored, but no longer active. This transition is made possible by the cumulative processes that have already unfolded throughout the night. Neural slowing has reduced urgency. Chemistry has softened reactivity. Memory processing has weakened emotional charge, and attention has lost its grip. Together, these changes alter how fear is represented internally. The brain no longer reconstructs fear with bodily intensity. It reconstructs it abstractly as a pattern without sensation. Fear becomes something the brain remembers, not something the body prepares for. Neurologically, this reflects a shift from limbic dominance to integrative processing. Emotional centers reduce their influence while associative networks take over. Information is distributed rather than concentrated. Fear no longer occupies a central position in awareness. It is placed alongside countless other pieces of stored experience, stripped of privilege. In this distributed state, fear cannot dominate because it no longer has exclusive access to attention or arousal. This is why, at this depth of the night, fear feels distant, even if it is still conceptually present. A thought about a fear may arise, but it does not carry bodily consequence. The heart does not react. Muscles do not tense. Breathing remains slow and steady. The mind acknowledges the idea and moves on. Fear has lost its ability to recruit the body, and without the body, it cannot fully exist as an experience. This transformation also alters meaning. Fear, when experienced directly, narrows meaning around survival. Everything becomes evaluated in terms of threat and safety. When fear becomes information, meaning expands again. The brain can place the fear within a broader context, seeing how it fits into past learning without allowing it to define the present. Fear becomes one chapter in a larger story rather than the story itself. Importantly, this shift does not eliminate the usefulness of fear. The information remains accessible. If circumstances change, the brain can still retrieve and reactivate fear when needed. What changes is timing. Fear is no longer prematurely activated. It is stored until relevant. This is the mark of a well-regulated system. The brain has not lost its capacity for fear. It has learned when not to use it. As this process repeats night after night, the brain becomes increasingly efficient at converting fear into information. Emotional responses that once lingered for hours now resolve more quickly. The system anticipates the transition from experience to storage. Fear activates, is registered, and is then quietly filed away. This efficiency reduces overall emotional load, freeing cognitive and physiological resources for restoration. At this stage, consciousness itself is becoming less distinct. The mind is no longer engaged in evaluating what is happening internally. Experience becomes shallow, diffuse, and impersonal. Fear cannot survive in such conditions. It requires depth, focus, and self-reference. When these dissolve, fear fades completely, not because it was resisted, but because it has already been transformed into something that no longer needs to be felt. In this way, fear completes its final evolution of the night. It begins as sensation, becomes memory, and ends as information. Once this transformation is complete, there is nothing left for fear to do. The brain has learned what it needs to learn. What remains is a quiet readiness for sleep, where experience itself is no longer organized around emotion, but around rest. In the last phase before sleep fully takes over, the brain reaches a state where even information begins to lose importance. Fear has already been transformed from experience into memory, and from memory into neutral knowledge. Now, even that knowledge begins to loosen its hold. The mind is no longer interested in organizing, categorizing, or storing. Its remaining task is release. This release is not dramatic. It is quiet, gradual, and almost imperceptible. The brain stops asking what anything means. It stops deciding what should be kept. In doing so, it allows the final traces of fear to drift out of relevance. At this depth, consciousness itself is thinning. Awareness is present, but it is no longer anchored to content. Thoughts arise without attachment and fade without conclusion. Sensations appear without interpretation. The brain no longer distinguishes between internal and external events with any precision. Fear, which depends on distinction, cannot survive here. There is no clear boundary between observer and experience, no sense of self that needs protection, no future that requires preparation. Fear has no reference point left. Neurologically, This phase reflects maximal disengagement of evaluative systems. Networks that once monitored significance, relevance, and consequence have gone offline. What remains are slow, synchronized patterns of activity that favor continuity over differentiation. The brain is no longer solving problems or integrating lessons. It is simply maintaining stability while transitioning into unconsciousness. In this mode, fear is not suppressed, it is irrelevant. The system that once gave fear meaning is no longer active. This is why the final release often feels like a gentle fading rather than a moment of relief. There is no clear instant when fear disappears. It simply stops returning. The mind notices that nothing is being held anymore. Attention no longer checks for danger. Memory no longer presents content for review. The body no longer prepares for anything. What remains is a neutral, floating awareness that does not resist or pursue any experience. Importantly, this release cannot be forced. Any attempt to observe it too closely reactivates wakeful systems and delays the transition. The brain must be allowed to let go on its own terms. This is why sleep cannot be commanded. It emerges when there is nothing left to manage. Fear dissolves not because it has been resolved intellectually, but because the mind has ceased to operate at the level where fear has meaning. Over countless nights, the brain learns this sequence intimately. It learns that fear, no matter how convincing earlier in the evening, always loses coherence as this state approaches. This learning becomes implicit. The nervous system begins to trust the process. Fear arises with less insistence, knowing it will not be carried forward. The mind becomes less reactive because it remembers, at a level beyond memory, that release is inevitable. In this final stage, rest does not feel like an event that happens next. It feels like an absence of the need for events at all. Experience thins until there is almost nothing left to experience. Fear, having completed every role it could possibly serve, signal, memory, information, quietly disappears without announcement. And in that disappearance, the brain crosses the last threshold, leaving wakefulness behind and entering sleep not as a destination, but as a natural continuation of letting go. By the time the brain reaches the deepest edges of wakefulness, one final understanding quietly takes shape, not as a thought, but as a felt certainty. Fear is not who you are. It is not a permanent feature of the mind. It is a state the brain enters under specific conditions, for specific reasons, and only for as long as those reasons remain relevant. This distinction matters because much of fear's power comes from the belief that it reflects something essential or enduring. In reality, fear is transient by design. It was never meant to define identity, only to modify behavior temporarily. Throughout the night, the brain has demonstrated this truth repeatedly. Fear appeared, intensified, softened, fragmented, and finally dissolved, not because it was defeated, but because the conditions that supported it changed. This cycle reveals fear's true nature. It is conditional. It depends on timing, chemistry, attention, memory, and perception. When those variables shift, fear shifts with them. The brain does not cling to fear out of habit or preference. It releases it as soon as it no longer serves a function. Understanding fear as a temporary state reframes the entire experience of nighttime anxiety. Fear feels convincing when it is active because the brain treats it as relevant in that moment, but relevance is not permanence. The same system that generates fear also contains the mechanisms to deactivate it. The brain is not trapped in fear, it is moving through it. Night after night, this movement repeats, even when it goes unnoticed. Fear rises, does its work, and then gives way to quieter processes that have always been waiting beneath it. This realization is not cognitive reassurance, it is biological observation. Across all the stages of the night, fear never remains stable. It is reshaped by slowing neural rhythms, softened by chemistry, diluted by memory rebalancing, and finally rendered irrelevant by the collapse of urgency and self-reference. A permanent trait would not behave this way. A permanent trait would persist across states. Fear does not. It dissolves when the brain enters modes where it cannot operate. Importantly, this does not mean fear is meaningless or weak. On the contrary, fear is powerful precisely because it is temporary. It mobilizes the system quickly and then steps aside. A signal that remained active indefinitely would lose its value. The brain preserves fear's effectiveness by limiting its duration. When fear appears at night, it is not announcing something about your future or your character. It is signaling that the brain is transitioning between modes. It is part of the passage, not the destination. As this understanding settles not as a thought, but as an internal quiet, fear loses one of its last sources of intensity, identification. The mind no longer asks, "Why am I like this?" or "What does this say about me?" Fear is no longer interpreted as evidence of instability or danger. It is seen implicitly as a state that passes, and states that pass do not require intervention. They require time. At this depth of night, the brain no longer monitors fear to evaluate it. It does not track whether fear is increasing or decreasing. It simply continues its descent into slower, more unified states. Fear fades because the mind is no longer organized around holding any state in place. Experience becomes fluid. Nothing is fixed long enough to define anything else. This is the final gift of understanding fear biologically rather than personally. Fear does not need to be solved. It needs to be outlived by the changing conditions of the brain. And as the night completes its work, fear does exactly what it has always done when its role is finished. It lets go, leaving behind a mind that is no longer trying to be anything at all, and is therefore free to sleep. As the mind moves deeper into its final resting state, a subtle but decisive shift occurs in the relationship between fear and awareness. Fear no longer needs to be managed, questioned, or altered. Control quietly withdraws, and with it, the effort that once gave fear its remaining influence. The brain reaches a state where understanding does not arrive as explanation, but as non-interference. Fear is allowed to exist without response, and in that allowance, it loses its final source of energy. Control is one of the last waking functions to release its grip. During the day, control is essential. It organizes behavior, suppresses impulses, and directs attention toward goals. Fear often becomes problematic, not because it exists, but because control attempts to dominate it. Effort is applied, resistance forms, and attention becomes fixed. At night, this strategy no longer works. The brain does not have the resources to maintain control, nor does it need to. When control fades, fear is no longer treated as something that must be handled. It becomes just another passing state. This release of control is not passive resignation. It is a biological transition. As higher-order regulatory systems disengage, the brain stops monitoring internal states for correction. Awareness remains, but it is no longer directive. Thoughts appear without prompting, sensations arise without interpretation, and emotions surface without judgment. Fear may still be present, but it is no longer framed as a problem. Without the framing of something to fix, fear has no role to play. Neurologically, this reflects a shutdown of evaluative loops. Circuits that once checked, rechecked, and attempted to modify experience become inactive. The brain no longer measures intensity or duration. It no longer compares current states to desired ones. This absence of comparison is critical. Fear gains strength when it is evaluated against an imagined alternative. When there is no alternative being referenced, fear loses contrast. It blends into the background of awareness and fades naturally. In this state, understanding fear does not mean analyzing its origin or purpose. It means recognizing at a visceral level that nothing needs to be done. The body does not need to prepare. The mind does not need to respond. The system is no longer oriented toward outcome. This understanding is quiet and non-verbal. It does not arrive as a conclusion. It arrives as a lack of urgency. As this understanding settles, fear becomes increasingly transient. It may arise briefly, but it passes through without leaving residue. The brain no longer tags fear as important. Without tagging, memory does not reinforce it. Without reinforcement, fear cannot recur with intensity. The system learns, through repetition, that fear does not require engagement. This learning is deeper than cognition. It is embedded in how the nervous system allocates energy. Over time, this non-controlling relationship with fear generalizes beyond the night. The brain becomes less reactive overall. Fear still appears when necessary, but it no longer dominates experience unnecessarily. The system trusts its own ability to regulate without constant intervention. This trust is not conscious. It is felt as ease. In the final moments before sleep, even understanding dissolves. There is no longer a subject observing fear or an object being observed. Experience becomes contentless. Fear cannot exist without separation. When separation disappears, fear does not end, it becomes impossible. This is the quiet resolution the night provides. Fear is neither conquered nor eliminated. It is understood without being held, allowed without being followed, and released without effort. The brain does not need to be told that fear is temporary. It demonstrates this truth every night by letting go of control and allowing the mind to slip into rest exactly as it was always meant to do. At the deepest edge of wakefulness, the brain arrives at a form of learning that does not resemble learning at all. There are no conclusions drawn, no rules articulated, no memories consciously stored. Instead, the nervous system absorbs a pattern through repetition. Fear arises and nothing follows. Again and again, across nights, this sequence unfolds. The absence of consequence becomes the lesson. The brain learns not through insight, but through lived neutrality. Fear appears, lingers briefly, and then passes without altering the course of the body or the world. This learning is profoundly different from cognitive understanding. During the day, learning often requires attention, effort, and reinforcement. At night, learning occurs precisely because effort is absent. The brain is no longer trying to solve or master anything. It is simply allowing experience to unfold. In this passive exposure, fear loses its privileged status. It is no longer treated as a signal that predicts change. It becomes one of many transient internal events, indistinguishable in importance from a passing image or a fleeting sensation. Neurologically, this reflects a recalibration of prediction systems. The brain is constantly updating its expectations based on outcomes. When fear consistently fails to predict danger during rest, its predictive value diminishes. The system stops allocating resources to it. This is not suppression. It is optimization. The brain conserves energy by reducing responses that do not lead to meaningful outcomes. Over time, fear triggers weaker activation, shorter duration, and less downstream effect. This process is subtle and slow because the brain is conservative by design. Systems that once ensured survival are not dismantled quickly. They are tested repeatedly against reality. Night after night, fear is allowed to exist without action. Each repetition adds weight to a new internal model. Fear does not require response in these conditions. Eventually, this model becomes dominant. Fear still arises, but it does so with less confidence. It no longer expects to be followed. As this learning consolidates, the experience of fear changes qualitatively. It loses urgency first, then intensity, then clarity. What remains is a vague echo rather than a compelling state. The mind no longer orients around it. Attention drifts elsewhere without effort. The body does not prepare. Breathing remains steady. The system behaves as though fear were already resolved, even while it is still faintly present. Importantly, this learning does not depend on success or failure. It does not require that fear be absent. It requires only that fear be non-consequential. The brain learns safety, not because fear disappears, but because fear stops mattering. This distinction explains why trying to eliminate fear often prolongs it. Elimination keeps fear relevant. Allowance renders it irrelevant. At this depth, consciousness itself is thinning. The mind no longer registers sequences clearly enough to track cause and effect. Learning happens beneath awareness, in the timing and weighting of neural responses. Fear is gradually deprioritized, not because it is judged incorrect, but because it is no longer useful. The system moves on. As the night completes this cycle, the brain carries the learning forward. Future nights begin with a slightly altered expectation. Fear may arise, but it arrives into a system that already knows how the sequence ends. This knowledge is not recalled, it is embodied. The nervous system anticipates release. Fear activates into a context that does not support it. In this way, the brain learns to let fear pass not through control, insight, or effort, but through repetition and non-engagement. The night teaches this lesson quietly, without instruction. And once learned, it does not need to be remembered. It simply shapes how fear appears, weakens, and dissolves until even the appearance becomes unnecessary, and the mind continues its descent into sleep unimpeded. At the very end of wakefulness, the brain reaches a state where effort itself dissolves. There is no longer an attempt to understand, regulate, remember, or learn. Even the quiet learning that occurred moments earlier has completed its work. What remains is not insight, not calm, not relief, but the absence of any need to maintain experience. Fear, which once demanded attention, has no context left in which it could operate. There is nothing to protect, nothing to predict, nothing to prepare for. The system that once elevated fear as a priority has fully disengaged. In this final state, awareness becomes shallow and wide at the same time. It is present but unfocused. Experience is no longer centered anywhere. Thoughts may still arise, but they do not connect. Sensations appear without being named. Emotional tones exist without direction. Fear cannot survive without structure, and structure is precisely what has disappeared. There is no narrative to interrupt, no self to defend, no future to warn about. Fear does not end, it simply has nowhere to land. Neurologically, this reflects the near-total withdrawal of systems responsible for salience and relevance. The brain is no longer highlighting anything as important. All signals are treated equally, which is to say, none are treated as important at all. This flattening of relevance is not dysfunction, it is the gateway to sleep. Consciousness cannot remain active when nothing stands out. Fear, which once relied on being singled out as significant, becomes indistinguishable from the background and fades into it. At this depth, the sense of being an observer also begins to dissolve. There is no longer a clear division between awareness and content. Experience is no longer happening times to time someone. It is simply happening, and then it is not. Fear, which depends on the relationship between a subject and a threat, cannot exist without that relationship. When subjectivity thins, fear loses its final condition for existence. This is why the final release feels so ordinary that it often goes unnoticed. There is no dramatic moment when fear disappears. There is no sense of accomplishment or resolution. The mind does not register success. It simply stops registering anything that requires attention. The last traces of fear dissolve not into calm, but into irrelevance. Calm implies contrast. Here, there is no contrast left. Over time, this repeated nightly disappearance of fear leaves a subtle imprint. The nervous system learns, at a level far below conscious memory, that fear always ends this way, not with answers, not with solutions, but with the quiet realization that nothing needed to be held in the first place. This learning does not create confidence or courage, it creates neutrality. Fear loses its authority not because it is disproven, but because it is outlasted. In this final moment before sleep, the brain is no longer managing experience. It has stopped even letting go, because letting go implies effort. There is simply nothing happening that requires response. Awareness thins to the point where even noticing would require too much energy. Fear has completed its journey from signal to memory to information to irrelevance. And in that irrelevance, sleep does not arrive as an event. It arrives as the absence of the need to arrive anywhere at all.